In November 1621, something happened that most people today completely misunderstand. Around 50 English settlers and nearly 90 native warriors gathered in Plymouth for a 3-day feast. But if you imagine a table filled with turkey, mashed potatoes, and pumpkin pie, you're already wrong. The reality of that meal would surprise almost every modern family celebrating Thanksgiving today. There's no sweet cranberry sauce, no buttery stuffing, and definitely no pies. Instead, the table was filled with foods that came directly from the land, many of which people today wouldn't even recognize. Historical accounts from people like William Bradford and Edward Winslow give us clues, and historians have spent centuries piecing together what was actually eaten during those 3 days. One of the simplest foods present was watercress. Before imported vegetables became common, settlers relied on wild greens growing near freshwater streams. Watercress was easy to gather, packed with nutrients, and required no cooking. It was likely tossed together as a basic salad, possibly with a splash of vinegar brought from England. Another important ingredient was wild leeks, also known as ramps. These strong, onion-like plants grew naturally in the region and were used to flavor meats. They were often roasted directly in fire embers, turning soft and slightly sweet inside. The settlers were already familiar with similar plants from Europe, but the American versions were stronger and more abundant. Nuts also played a big role. Black walnuts, much tougher and more intense in flavor than European ones, had to be cracked open by hand, often taking hours of work. These nuts were added to porridge or used to enhance other dishes. Chestnuts were even more valuable. Before a devastating disease wiped them out centuries later, American chestnut trees produced massive amounts of sweet, starchy nuts. Then there were acorns, something most people today would never consider food. But Native Americans had perfected the process of removing their bitterness. Once treated properly, acorns could be turned into flour and mixed with cornmeal to create filling meals. This wasn't a fancy feast. It was survival, creativity, and cooperation on a table. But here's where it gets even crazier. Some of the next foods were so unusual, most people today wouldn't even believe they were eaten, and one of them actually helped save the entire colony. If you think the first part already sounded unfamiliar, what comes next takes things even further away from the Thanksgiving we know today. The real 1621 feast included foods that were not only different, but in some cases completely forgotten over time. Take Jerusalem artichokes, for example. Despite the name, they have nothing to do with Jerusalem or artichokes. These were actually roots from a sunflower plant, growing wild across the land. They could be eaten raw for a crunchy texture or roasted until soft and nutty. Early settlers quickly adopted them as a reliable food source. Another surprising staple was something called groundnuts, not peanuts but small tubers growing along riverbanks. These roots were incredibly important, especially during the harsh winter before the feast. They were boiled and mashed into simple meals that helped keep the settlers alive. Today, they still grow in the wild, but most people walk right past them without even knowing. Corn, however, was the true foundation of the meal. But this wasn't the sweet yellow corn we eat today. It was a harder variety, often colorful, that had to be dried and ground into meal. It was used in almost everything: porridge, bread, and stews. Pumpkin was also present, but not in pie form. There was no flour, no ovens, and very little sugar. Instead, pumpkin was boiled until soft, sometimes mixed with natural sweetness like maple sap. Simple corn cakes replaced bread, cooked on hot stones. And along the shore, mussels and clams were collected in huge amounts, quick, easy, and essential for survival. But now comes the biggest twist. The food you're about to hear next didn't just replace turkey. They completely rewrite what the main course of Thanksgiving really was.